The year is 753 BCE, and along the muddy banks of the Tiber River, something extraordinary is about to unfold. Two abandoned infants cry out beneath the Italian sun, their voices echoing across hills that will one day command the entire known world. This moment, shrouded in legend and wrapped in divine mystery, marks the beginning of the most powerful civilization humanity has ever witnessed. Tonight, as you drift into peaceful sleep, we'll journey through over 1,000 years of triumph, betrayal, conquest, and ultimate transformation that shaped the very foundations of our modern world. The Roman Empire didn't emerge overnight like some divine proclamation. Instead, it grew from humble beginnings through centuries of calculated ambition, brutal warfare, and political genius that would make Machiavelli himself take notes. From a collection of muddy hilltop villages to masters of 3 continents, the Romans created something unprecedented in human history. An empire so vast that when you stood at its northern frontier in fog-covered Britain, the southern border lay beyond the scorching Sahara Desert. An empire so enduring that its laws still govern our courts today. Its language still echoes in our speech, and its architectural principles still support our grandest buildings. But here's what makes this story truly captivating. The Romans weren't content with mere conquest. They transformed everything they touched. They didn't just defeat enemies. They absorbed their strengths. They didn't just build roads. They connected civilizations. They didn't just establish laws. They created justice systems that balanced individual rights with collective responsibility in ways that still influence democratic societies across the globe. This empire became the crucible where Greek philosophy met Germanic warrior culture, where Egyptian mysticism encountered Celtic traditions, and where diverse peoples found common ground under the eagles of the legions. The tale we're about to explore spans more than a millennium of human drama. We'll witness the rise and fall of kings, the birth of republican government, the collapse of democracy into dictatorship, and the emergence of imperial power that would endure for another 1,000 years in the East. We'll follow legendary figures whose names still resonate today. Julius Caesar, whose ambition redefined what one man could achieve. Augustus, who transformed a war-torn republic into the foundation of lasting peace. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor who pondered the meaning of existence while defending civilization's borders. Constantine, who embraced a revolutionary new faith and moved the empire's heart to a new city that would outlast Rome itself. Tonight, as your mind settles into rest, these ancient voices will whisper their stories. The clash of bronze against bronze at forgotten battles, the roar of crowds in the Colosseum, the scratch of stylus on wax as senators debated the fate of nations, the prayers of soldiers far from home, holding the line against barbarian invasions, the quiet conversations of merchants whose trade routes connected Britain to India, the passionate arguments of early Christians whose faith would eventually transform an empire built on pagan traditions. Our journey begins in the mists of legend, where truth and myth intertwine like morning fog over the 7 hills. The story the Romans told about their origins reveals as much about their character as any historical document ever could. According to the ancient tales carefully preserved by Roman historians, the saga begins not in Italy, but in the smoking ruins of Troy. When that legendary city fell to Greek cunning and the famous wooden horse, one hero escaped the carnage. Aeneas, son of the goddess Venus and the mortal Anchises, carried his elderly father on his shoulders through the burning streets and led the surviving Trojans on an epic voyage across the Mediterranean Sea. Years of wandering, divine prophecy led Aeneas to the shores of Latium, that fertile. The gods themselves, it seemed, had chosen these refugees for greatness. after region along the Italian coast where the Tiber River meets the sea. Here, among the local Latin tribes, Aeneas established a new homeland for his people. He married Lavinia, daughter of King Latinus, and founded the city of Lavinium. His son Ascanius later established Alba Longa, which would serve 3 centuries, the descendants of Aeneas' rule as the mother city of Rome itself. Ford Alba Longa, in an unbroken line that stretched through 14 generations of kings. This genealogy, meticulously preserved in Roman tradition, connected the future masters of the world directly to divine ancestry and the heroic age of Troy. The last of these Alban kings, Numitor, possessed the throne by right of birth, but his younger brother Amulius harbored different ambitions entirely. Amulius seized power through the classic combination of military force and political manipulation that would characterize Roman politics for centuries to come. After overthrowing his brother, the usurper faced a critical problem. Numitor's daughter, Rhea Silvia, represented a direct threat to his rule, as any children she bore would possess stronger claims to the throne than his own descendants. Amulius solved this dilemma with characteristic ruthlessness. He forced Rhea Silvia to become a Vestal virgin, binding her to 30 years of sacred celibacy that would prevent her from producing legitimate heirs. But fate, as the Romans understood it, serves purposes greater than human ambition. Mars, the god of war, looked upon the beautiful priestess with divine desire. In the sacred grove where she gathered water for temple rituals, the god appeared to her in all his terrible glory. Their union, both blessed and cursed by its divine nature, produced twin sons whose destiny would eclipse even their godly father's achievements. When Amulius discovered the pregnancy, his rage knew no bounds. The birth of these children threatened everything he had schemed to achieve. He ordered his servants to seize the infants immediately after birth and cast them into the flooding waters of the Tiber River. The faithful servants, perhaps moved by mercy or fear of divine retribution, placed the babies in a basket and set them adrift on the swollen current, leaving their fate to the gods who had brought them into existence. The river, however, had other plans. Instead of carrying the twins to their doom, the gentle current deposited them safely on the muddy banks beneath the Palatine Hill. Here, according to legend, a she-wolf discovered the crying infants. Rather than devouring this easy prey, the wild animal recognized something sacred in these abandoned children. She carried them to her den and nursed them with her own milk, protecting them from the elements and other predators with fierce maternal instincts that seemed to honor their divine parentage. A shepherd named Faustulus, tending his flocks on the hillside, witnessed this miraculous scene. Understanding that divine providence had preserved these children for some greater purpose, he gathered them up and brought them home to his wife Acca Laurentia. This humble couple raised the twins as their own sons, naming them Romulus and Remus. Under their care, the boys grew strong and bold, displaying the courage and leadership that marked their divine heritage. As young men, Romulus and Remus discovered their true identity through a series of adventures that revealed both their noble birth and their destined greatness. They learned of their grandfather Numitor's rightful claim to the throne of Alba Longa and their uncle Amulius's treacherous usurpation. With the passionate idealism of youth and the strength that came from their divine father, the twins organized a rebellion that restored their grandfather to power and brought justice to their family's wrongs. Numitor, grateful for his restoration and proud of his grandson's achievements, granted them permission to establish their own city in the region where the she-wolf had saved their lives. This gift would prove both a blessing and a curse, as the twins soon discovered that shared power presents challenges that individual authority avoids entirely. The brothers chose different hills for their new settlement, each claiming divine signs that supported his preference. Romulus favoured the Palatine Hill, where their rescue had occurred, while Remus preferred the Aventine Hill, which offered superior defensive advantages and broader views of the surrounding countryside. This disagreement, seemingly minor, reflected deeper differences in their personalities and visions for their future city. To resolve the dispute, they agreed to consult the gods through augury, the sacred art of interpreting divine will through the flight patterns of birds. Each brother stationed himself on his chosen hill and watched the sky for omens. Remus saw 6 vultures circling overhead, a sign he interpreted as divine approval for his location. But Romulus witnessed to confirm his selection of the Palatine Hill. 12 vultures, a more powerful omen that seem. The brothers' disagreement escalated from religious interpretation to personal conflict, as each insisted that his sign carried greater divine authority. Their followers began taking sides, transforming what had begun as a sacred ritual into the foundation for civil war. The situation deteriorated further when Romulus began constructing fortifications around his chosen site, marking the sacred boundary with a plough, and declaring that anyone who crossed this line without permission would face death. Remus, perhaps testing his brother's resolve or expressing his contempt for these arbitrary boundaries, leaped over the newly ploughed furrow. Romulus, faced with his first challenge as a leader, made the decision that would haunt Roman history for centuries to come. True to his oath and demonstrating the ruthless dedication to law that would characterize Roman governance, he struck down his own brother with a single blow. Standing over Remus's lifeless body, Romulus spoke the words that would echo through Roman consciousness for over a millennium. "So perish anyone who crosses my walls." With this act of fraternal violence, Rome was born in blood, establishing a precedent that would define its character throughout its existence. The city that would eventually preach peace through strength began with the ultimate sacrifice of family bonds to political necessity. The date, according to careful Roman calculations, was April 21st, 753 BCE. The festival of Pyrrhic, dedicated to the pastoral god Pales, provided an auspicious moment for this foundation. But the divine approval that Romans claimed for their city's birth came at the cost of brothers' blood, a price that seemed to demand endless repetition throughout their history. Romulus became the first king of Rome, ruling over a settlement that initially consisted of little more than a fortified hilltop village. But from these humble beginnings, he began implementing the institutions and policies that would eventually carry Roman power to the ends of the earth. He established the Senate, that advisory body of elders whose wisdom would guide Roman decision-making for centuries to come. He created the citizen assemblies that gave the people a voice in their governance, though limited by careful restrictions that preserved elite authority. Most importantly, he divided the population into 2 classes that would define Roman social structure throughout the Republican Empire. The patricians, descended from the original settlers and fathers of the community, and the plebeians, the common people who joined the settlement later. But Romulus faced an immediate problem that threatened his new city's survival. His followers were almost entirely men, warriors and adventurers who had joined his cause, but lacked wives and families to ensure the community's continuation. Without women and children, Rome would remain a temporary military camp, rather than becoming a permanent civilization. The solution Romulus devised revealed both his strategic brilliance and his willingness to employ deception in service of Roman interests. He announced a great festival in honor of Neptune, inviting all the neighboring tribes to join in the celebrations. The Sabines, who lived in the hills northeast of Rome, accepted this invitation eagerly, bringing their entire families to enjoy the promised entertainment and hospitality. During the height of the festivities, when wine had loosened vigilance and the visitors were scattered throughout the celebration, Romulus gave a predetermined signal. The Roman men seized the unmarried Sabine women and carried them off to become their wives. while allowing the men and married women to depart unharmed. This calculated act of mass abduction, known to history as the rape of the Sabine women, provided Rome with the population base it needed, while simultaneously creating the military crisis that would forge its early character. The Sabine men, naturally, demanded the return of their daughters and sisters. When Romulus refused, they prepared for war under the leadership of their king, Titus Tatius. The conflict that followed tested Rome's military capabilities and revealed the complex loyalties that would always characterize this multinational empire. The war raged for several years, with neither side able to achieve decisive victory. The Romans fought with the desperate courage of men defending their homes and newly established families, while the Sabines battled with the righteous fury of fathers seeking to reclaim their stolen children. The conflict reached its climax when the two armies faced each other on the plain between the Palatine and Capitoline hills, prepared for a final battle that would determine Rome's fate. But at the crucial moment, the Sabine women themselves intervened. Led by Hersilia, who had become Romulus's wife, they rushed onto the battlefield between the opposing forces. With their own children in their arms and their loyalty divided between their birth families and their Roman husbands, they pleaded for peace and reconciliation, rather than continued bloodshed that would leave them either widowed or orphaned, regardless of the outcome. This dramatic intervention led to a negotiated settlement that established the pattern for Roman expansion throughout history. Rather than demanding unconditional surrender or seeking to destroy their enemies, the Romans offered integration and shared power. Romulus and Titus Tatius agreed to rule jointly over a combined Roman Sabine kingdom, with both peoples enjoying equal rights and privileges. The Sabines were invited to settle on the Capitoline and Quirinal hills, expanding Rome's territory while increasing its population and military strength. This fusion of Roman and Sabine communities created the foundation for Rome's later genius at incorporating conquered peoples into its political and social structure. Unlike other ancient empires that relied on force alone to maintain control over subject populations, Rome consistently offered pathways to citizenship and advancement that transformed former enemies into loyal defenders of Roman interests. The joint reign lasted for 5 years, until Titus Tatius was killed in a conflict with the people of Lavinium. Rather than using this opportunity to restore sole rule, Romulus chose to continue the inclusive policies that had brought peace and prosperity to his kingdom. He welcomed refugees and exiles from throughout Italy, offering them citizenship and opportunity in exchange for loyalty to Rome's growing community. Under Romulus's leadership, Rome's population swelled from a few hundred warriors to several thousand citizens, while its territory expanded to include all 7 of the famous hills that would define the Eternal City. He established the basic religious institutions that would govern Roman spiritual life, creating priesthoods and festivals that honored both the traditional gods and the deified spirits of the community's founders. But perhaps most importantly, Romulus created the military organization that would eventually conquer the world. He divided the citizen population into centuries based on age and wealth, with each group having specific military obligations and civic responsibilities. The youngest and strongest men formed the frontline infantry, while older citizens provided support services, and the wealthiest supplied cavalry and specialized equipment. This system ensured that every citizen had both a stake in Rome's success and a duty to defend it, creating the civic spirit that would sustain Roman expansion for centuries to come. Unlike mercenary armies that fought only for pay, or feudal levies that served reluctantly, Roman soldiers fought for their own homes, their own families, and their own future prosperity. After 37 years of rule, Romulus vanished during a thunderstorm while reviewing his troops on the Campus Martius. Some witnesses claimed they saw him ascending to heaven in a chariot of fire, while others whispered that the senators had murdered him during the confusion of the storm. Regardless of the truth, Romulus was deified as the god Quirinus, becoming the patron deity of Roman citizens and the divine protector of the city he had founded. The pattern established by Rome's legendary founder would echo through centuries of expansion, adaptation, and transformation that carried Roman power from the muddy banks of the Tiber to the distant shores of Britain and the sun-baked deserts of Africa. The city born in fraternal blood would grow to encompass the entire Mediterranean world, creating an empire that endures in memory long after its legions marched for the final time. The throne that Romulus left vacant presented Rome with its first constitutional crisis. How does a city founded by divine appointment choose its next ruler? The Romans, displaying the practical wisdom that would characterize their approach to governance throughout history, rejected both hereditary succession and popular election in that body of elder statesmen in favor of a more nuanced solution. The Senate Romulus had established would select candidates, but the gods themselves would confirm the choice through sacred rituals that bound heaven and earth in eternal covenant. The man they chose could not have been more different from Rome's warrior founder. Numa Pompilius ruled the Sabine city of Cures, with a reputation for wisdom, piety, and peaceful governance that stood in stark contrast to Romulus's military achievements. When Roman ambassadors arrived at his court bearing the offer of kingship, Numa initially refused, questioning whether a peaceful scholar could successfully rule a city that had been forged in warfare and conquest. But the Romans persisted, and divine omens seemed to support their choice. Birds flew in auspicious patterns, sacred fires burned with unusual brightness, and priests reported dreams that suggested heavenly approval for this unlikely king. Numa finally accepted the crown in 715 BCE, beginning a reign that would transform Rome from a military camp into a civilized state, governed by law, custom, and religious observance. Where Romulus had conquered through strength, Numa would rule through wisdom. He immediately closed the doors of the Temple of Janus, a symbolic act that announced Rome's transition from war to peace. For the 43 years of his reign, those doors remained sealed, marking the longest period of uninterrupted peace in Roman history. But this peace was not the peace of weakness or withdrawal. Instead, Numa used these decades to construct the institutional foundations that would support Rome's future expansion and governance. The king's first priority involved establishing a comprehensive legal code that would govern relationships between citizens, regulate commercial transactions, and define the boundaries between acceptable and forbidden behavior. Working with legal scholars from throughout central Italy, Numa created laws that balanced individual rights with collective responsibilities, establishing precedents for justice that would influence Roman jurisprudence for centuries to come. But law alone could not create civilization. Numa understood that lasting peace required shared beliefs, common rituals, and spiritual institutions that connected individual citizens to the divine order that governed the universe. He established the College of Pontifices, the high priests who would oversee religious observances and maintain the sacred traditions that bound the community together. He created the Vestal Virgins, those sacred priestesses whose purity ensured divine protection for the city, and whose eternal flame symbolized Rome's permanent endurance. Most significantly, Numa reformed the calendar itself, organizing time according to lunar cycles that reflected both astronomical observations and religious requirements. His 12-month year, beginning in January rather than March, established rhythms of work and worship that structured Roman life around both practical necessities and spiritual obligations. The festivals he instituted honored not only the great gods of war and harvest, but also the smaller deities who governed daily activities like boundary marking, door opening, and threshold crossing. Under Numa's guidance, Rome developed the religious sensibility that would distinguish Roman civilization from its neighbors throughout history. Unlike the Greeks, who viewed their gods as capricious beings driven by human-like passions and conflicts, the Romans understood divinity as a contractual relationship based on mutual obligation and precise ritual observance. If humans performed their ceremonies correctly and fulfilled their vows completely, the gods were bound to provide protection, prosperity, and victory in return. This legalistic approach to divine relationships reflected the Roman character in its purest form. Just as their earthly contracts required specific performance from all parties, their heavenly agreements demanded exact compliance with ritual requirements and moral obligations. The gods became, in essence, the ultimate guarantors of Roman law, while religious observance became a form of civic duty that strengthened the bonds holding society together. Numa also established the institution that would prove crucial to Rome's later expansion: the fetial priests, who governed the sacred laws of war and peace. These specialists determined when conflicts could be justly initiated, how treaties should be negotiated, and what obligations Rome owed to both allies and enemies. Their rituals transformed warfare from random violence into regulated activity governed by divine law and human justice. When neighboring tribes violated agreements or threatened Roman interests, the fetials would travel to their territories and demand satisfaction according to established procedures. Only after these diplomatic efforts failed could Rome legitimately resort to military action, and even then, the war had to be conducted according to religious requirements that limited unnecessary destruction and protected non-combatants. This systematic approach to international relations gave Rome enormous advantages over neighbors who relied on opportunistic raiding or temporary alliances. Roman treaties carried divine sanction that made their violation not merely politically unwise, but spiritually dangerous. Roman military campaigns enjoyed heavenly approval that strengthened soldier morale while undermining enemy confidence. Most importantly, Roman peace offered genuine security based on law rather than fear, making former enemies willing to accept Roman leadership in exchange for protection and prosperity. Numa's death in 673 BCE marked the end of an era, but his institutional legacy endured throughout Roman history. The religious calendar he established continued to govern Roman life for over 7 centuries. The legal principles he articulated influenced Roman jurisprudence through the empire's final days. The peaceful methods he demonstrated for resolving conflicts became the foundation for Roman diplomacy that eventually united the Mediterranean world under a single government. The third king, Tullus Hostilius, represented a return to Rome's military traditions, but with a crucial difference. Where Romulus had fought for survival and expansion, Tullus waged war according to the legal and religious principles that Numa had established. His reign began with a conflict that would demonstrate both Rome's growing power and its evolving approach to international relations. The city of Alba Longa, that mother city from which Rome's founders had originally come, had grown jealous of its offspring's increasing prominence. Border disputes escalated into cattle raids, which developed into formal complaints that required resolution through either negotiation or combat. Following the procedures established by the fetial priests, Roman ambassadors demanded satisfaction for injuries suffered by Roman citizens, while Alban representatives presented counterclaims for damages inflicted by Roman soldiers. When diplomacy failed to produce agreement, both sides prepared for war, but not the chaotic bloodbath that typically characterized conflicts between Italian tribes. Instead, they agreed to a more civilized solution that would minimize casualties while clearly establishing which city deserved divine favor and political supremacy. Each side would select 3 champions to fight in single combat, with the losing city becoming subject to the winner's authority. Alba Longa chose the Curiati brothers, triplets renowned throughout central Italy for their skill with sword and spear. Rome responded with the Herarchii, 3 brothers whose family had served as warriors since Romulus's time. The combat took place on the plain between the 2 cities, witnessed by both armies, and sanctified by religious ceremonies that ensured divine attention to the proceedings. The early stages of the fight went badly for Rome, as two of the hierarchy fell quickly to their opponent's superior coordination and experience. The surviving Roman brother Horatius found himself facing three wounded but still dangerous enemies who seemed certain to complete their victory. But Horatius employed a strategy that revealed the tactical intelligence that would characterize Roman military thinking throughout history. Feigning retreat, he drew the Curiatii into pursuing him across the battlefield, using their varying degrees of injury to separate them from mutual support. Then, turning suddenly, he defeated each Alban champion individually, transforming apparent defeat into complete victory through superior tactics and individual courage. This triumph established Rome's supremacy over Alba Longa and demonstrated the military virtues that would carry Roman arms to eventual world conquest. But the aftermath of victory revealed the moral complexities that would always accompany Roman expansion and the internal tensions that would eventually tear the empire apart. Horatius returned to Rome in triumph, bearing the spoils stripped from his defeated enemies as proof of his achievement. But at the city gates he encountered his sister Horatia, who had been betrothed to one of the Curiatii brothers. When she saw her lover's cloak among the trophies and began mourning his death, Horatius killed her in a moment of rage, declaring that no Roman should weep for enemies of the state. This act of domestic violence created Rome's first major legal crisis. Horatius had clearly committed murder, but he had also just saved the city through his heroic achievement. How could Rome punish its greatest hero without seeming ungrateful for his service? How could it ignore murder without undermining the law that protected all citizens? King Tullus resolved the dilemma through a legal innovation that would influence Roman jurisprudence for centuries. He established the principle that even heroes must answer to the law, but that exceptional service to the state could be considered as mitigation during sentencing. Horatius was tried, convicted, and sentenced to death, but then immediately pardoned in recognition of his military achievement and the extenuating circumstances that had provoked his crime. This precedent established the complex relationship between individual rights and state interests that would define Roman political thought throughout its history. Citizens owed absolute loyalty to the community, but the community owed protection and justice to its citizens in return. Heroes who served Rome faithfully could expect consideration for their service, but no one stood above the law that governed all members of society. The destruction of Alba Longa that followed this victory revealed another aspect of Roman expansion that would characterize their approach to conquest throughout the Mediterranean world. Rather than simply looting the defeated city and withdrawing, the Romans systematically dismantled Alba Longa's political independence, while preserving its people and their valuable skills. The entire population was relocated to Rome, where they received citizenship and were integrated into existing tribes and centuries. The Alban aristocracy joined the Roman Senate, bringing their wealth, connections, and political experience to strengthen Rome's governing class. Skilled craftsmen, experienced soldiers, and successful merchants found opportunities in Rome that exceeded what they had enjoyed in their original home. This policy of incorporation, rather than extermination, gave Rome access to the full human resources of conquered territories, while creating powerful incentives for submission rather than desperate resistance. Former enemies became stakeholders in Rome's continued success, while their skills and knowledge strengthened Roman capabilities for future expansion. Under Tullus Hostilius, Rome's military reputation grew throughout central Italy, as successful campaigns against the Sabines, Fidenates, and other neighboring tribes expanded both Roman territory and Roman confidence. But the king's devotion to warfare eventually brought divine displeasure, according to Roman historians, who saw moral lessons in every historical event. A plague struck Rome during the final years of Tullus's reign, killing thousands of citizens and weakening the army that had brought so many victories. When the king attempted to appease the gods through elaborate sacrifices and purification ceremonies, lightning struck the royal palace, killing Tullus himself and demonstrating that even successful rulers could not ignore the spiritual requirements that govern civilized behavior. The fourth king, Ancus Marcius, combined the military skills of Tullus with the religious wisdom of Numa, creating a balanced approach to leadership that would characterize Rome's greatest rulers throughout history. A grandson of Numa Pompilius, Ancus understood both the necessity of warfare for Roman security and the importance of religious observance for divine favor. His reign marked Rome's first significant expansion beyond the traditional boundaries of central Italy. Military campaigns against the Latin tribes brought Roman control down to the mouth of the Tiber River, while the establishment of the port city of Ostia gave Rome direct access to Mediterranean trade routes that connected Italy to the broader ancient world. But Ancus's most significant achievement involved the construction of infrastructure that supported Rome's growing population and expanding territory. He built the first bridge across the Tiber River, connecting Rome proper to its territories on the western bank. He constructed aqueducts that brought fresh water from distant springs to supply the city's increasing needs. He established markets and commercial districts that attracted merchants from throughout the Mediterranean region. Most importantly, Ancus created the institutional framework for governing Rome's expanding territory through a system of colonies and allied communities that preserved local autonomy while ensuring Roman security interests. Rather than attempting to administer distant territories directly from Rome, he established Roman settlements at strategic locations while allowing existing communities to maintain their traditional governments under Roman oversight. This federal approach to expansion solved the fundamental problem that had destroyed previous empires: how to govern distant territories without either crushing local traditions or losing central control. Roman colonies provided military security and political loyalty, while allied communities contributed troops and resources in exchange for protection and access to Roman markets. The system created incentives for cooperation rather than rebellion, while distributing the costs and benefits of empire among all participants, rather than concentrating them in the capital city alone. Local elites could advance their careers through service to Rome, while ordinary citizens enjoyed the prosperity that came from participation in a larger economic and political system. When Ancus Marcius died in 616 BCE, Rome had evolved from a small city-state into a regional power capable of competing with the Etruscan cities to the north and the Greek colonies to the south. The foundations were in place for the dramatic expansion that would carry Roman power throughout the Italian peninsula and eventually across the entire Mediterranean world. But first, Rome would experience a transformation that demonstrated both the opportunities and dangers that come from cultural contact and foreign influence. The arrival of an ambitious immigrant from Etruria would introduce new technologies, new ideas, and new possibilities that would accelerate Rome's development while creating tensions that would influence Roman politics for centuries to come. The stranger, who would become Rome's fifth king, arrived at the city gates with a caravan that spoke of wealth, ambition, and foreign sophistication that immediately captured Roman attention. Lucius Tarquinius Priscus had abandoned his native Tarquinii in northern Etruria, driven not by poverty or persecution, but by the social limitations that constrained his advancement in a society that valued ancient bloodlines above personal merit. His father, Demaratus, had been a wealthy Corinthian merchant who had fled political turmoil in Greece and established himself among the Etruscan aristocracy through commercial success and strategic marriages. But in Etruria, foreign ancestry remained a permanent barrier to the highest political offices, no matter how great one's wealth or abilities might be. Lucius possessed both in abundance, yet found himself perpetually excluded from the inner circles of power that governed Etruscan city-states. His wife Tanaquil, herself descended from one of Tarquini's most prominent families, recognized that her husband's talents were being wasted in a society too rigid to appreciate them fully. When they learned of Rome's reputation for welcoming ambitious foreigners and rewarding merit regardless of origin, the couple made a decision that would alter the course of Roman history. They loaded their wealth onto wagons, gathered their most trusted servants and clients, and set out for the growing city that promised opportunities denied elsewhere. As their procession approached Rome's gates, an eagle descended from the clear sky and settled upon Lucius's head, carefully removing his cap with its talons before replacing it with ceremonial precision. Tanaquil, skilled in the Etruscan arts of divination, interpreted this omen as a divine sign that her husband was destined for royal authority. The gods themselves, it seemed, had marked him for greatness in his new home. King Ancus Marcius received the wealthy immigrants with the hospitality that Rome traditionally showed to useful newcomers. Lucius's evident prosperity, combined with his knowledge of Etruscan engineering techniques and Greek commercial practices, made him valuable to a kingdom seeking to expand its influence and capabilities. Within months, the immigrant had established himself among Rome's leading citizens, using his wealth to fund public works projects, while his wife's political acumen helped navigate the complex relationships that governed Roman society. When Ancus died in 616 BCE, the succession question arose once again, but this time with complications that previous transitions had avoided. The king's sons were still minors, unable to assume immediate authority, while various Roman nobles possessed claims based on family connections, military achievement, and popular support. In this uncertain environment, Lucius Tarquinius emerged as a compromise candidate who threatened no existing faction while bringing skills that all recognized as valuable. The Senate's selection of this foreign-born king marked a watershed moment in Roman political development. For the first time, merit and capability had triumphed over birth and tradition in the selection of supreme authority. The precedent established would influence Roman attitudes toward leadership throughout the Republican Empire, creating a culture that valued achievement over ancestry, while maintaining respect for the customs and institutions that provided stability. Tarquinius Priscus began his reign with ambitious construction projects that transformed Rome's physical appearance, while demonstrating the practical benefits that Etruscan expertise could bring to Roman development. He drained the marshy valleys between Rome's hills, creating the Forum Romanum that would serve as the city's commercial and political center for over a millennium. He constructed the first permanent shops and marketplaces that replaced temporary stalls with substantial buildings designed for long-term use. Most spectacularly, he began construction of the Circus Maximus, that enormous venue for chariot races and public entertainments that would eventually accommodate over 200,000 spectators. This project revealed the king's understanding that successful rulers must provide both bread and circuses for their subjects, ensuring not only physical survival, but also the shared experiences that create community identity and popular loyalty. The king's military campaigns expanded Roman territory while demonstrating tactical innovations borrowed from Etruscan warfare. His armies employed siege engines and engineering techniques that enabled them to capture fortified positions that had previously been impregnable. His cavalry units, organized according to Etruscan models, provided mobility and striking power that traditional Roman infantry formations had lacked. Successful wars against the Sabines and Latins brought both territory and prestige, while captured wealth funded additional public works that employed Roman citizens and beautified the growing city. The king established workshops where skilled Etruscan craftsmen taught Roman apprentices advanced techniques in metalworking, pottery production, and textile manufacture that improved both military equipment and civilian goods. But perhaps most significantly, Tarquinius Priscus expanded the Senate by adding 100 new members chosen from among the leading families of recently conquered territories. This innovation demonstrated the Roman genius for incorporating former enemies into the governing structure, rather than simply ruling over them as subjects. The new senators brought local knowledge, established relationships, and diverse perspectives that strengthened Roman decision-making, while creating powerful incentives for continued loyalty. The king also reformed the Roman army by adding new sentries to existing formations and creating specialized units that could perform functions beyond traditional infantry combat. Engineers, cavalry scouts, and siege specialists became permanent parts of Roman military organization, while standardized equipment and training procedures improved overall effectiveness and coordination. These military improvements proved their worth during campaigns that pushed Roman influence deeper into central Italy than any previous ruler had achieved. The capture of strategic towns like Calatia and Corniculum provided forward bases for further expansion, while demonstrating that Rome had evolved from a regional city-state into a genuine military power capable of projecting force across significant distances. The wealth generated by these victories funded additional urban improvements that continued Rome's transformation into a city worthy of its growing ambitions. Tarquinius constructed elaborate temples that employed the best architects and artists available, creating religious monuments that impress both Romans and foreign visitors with their scale and sophistication. The Temple of Jupiter. Optimus Maximus, begun during his reign, though not completed until after his death, established the architectural vocabulary that would characterize Roman religious buildings for centuries to come. Its massive foundation platform, elaborate decorative program, and commanding position atop the Capitoline Hill announced Rome's arrival as a major power while providing a suitable dwelling for the king of the gods. But the king's foreign origins, despite his obvious successes, created undercurrents of resentment among some traditional Roman families, who felt displaced by his innovations and threatened by his policies of inclusion. These tensions remained largely suppressed during his lifetime, held in check by his evident competence and the prosperity his rule had brought to the city. The assassination of Tarquinius Priscus in 579 BCE resulted not from popular uprising or foreign invasion, but from a conspiracy organized by the sons of his predecessor, Ancus Marcius. These princes, now grown to maturity, believed that their father's throne had been unjustly usurped by a foreign adventurer who had exploited their youth to steal their birthright. They hired assassins who struck down the king while he was hearing legal cases in the Forum, believing that his death would enable them to claim the crown that they considered rightfully theirs. But they had underestimated both the loyalty that Tarquinius had earned through his effective governance and the political sophistication of his widow, Tanaquil, acting with remarkable speed and decisiveness. The queen concealed news of her husband's death, while summoning Servius Tullius, the king's most trusted advisor, and the man he had designated as his successor. Servius Tullius represented yet another innovation in Roman leadership selection, as his background differed dramatically from all previous kings. Born into slavery, he had been raised in the royal household after his mother was captured during one of Tarquinius's military campaigns. The boy had displayed such exceptional intelligence and character that the king had freed him, educated him, and eventually adopted him as a son, while also arranging his marriage to the royal daughter. This elevation of a former slave to potential kingship shocked Roman sensibilities in some quarters, while perfectly embodying the meritocratic principles that Tarquinius had championed throughout his reign. Servius's rise demonstrated that in Rome, unlike in other ancient societies, talent and virtue could overcome even the most humble origins to achieve the highest honors. Tanaquil's management of the succession crisis revealed the informal but crucial role that royal women played in Roman politics. Speaking to the crowd that had gathered outside the palace, she announced that the king had been wounded but was recovering, and that he had appointed Servius Tullius to handle all official business during his convalescence. This deception provided time for Servius to consolidate support among the Senate and people, while the conspirators remained unaware that their plot had actually succeeded. When the truth finally emerged, Servius had already established himself so firmly in authority that the Marsi princes found themselves isolated and powerless. Their conspiracy had eliminated the king they hated, but had inadvertently elevated a successor who would prove even more transformative in his approach to Roman governance and society. Servius Tullius ruled for 44 years, from 578 to 535 BCE, implementing reforms that fundamentally restructured Roman society while establishing the constitutional framework that would govern the Republic for centuries to come. His most significant innovation involved the creation of a comprehensive census system that classified all Roman citizens according to their wealth rather than their birth, determining both their military obligations and their political rights based on their economic contributions to the state. This Servian constitution, as historians would later call it, divided the citizen population into 5 classes, each with specific responsibilities and privileges that reflected their capacity to serve the community. The wealthiest citizens, who could afford the most expensive military equipment, formed the heavy infantry that would bear the primary burden of combat, while also enjoying the greatest influence in political assemblies. Poorer citizens served as light infantry or support troops, with proportionally less political power, but also reduced financial obligations. The system created powerful incentives for economic advancement, while ensuring that those with the greatest stake in Roman society would have the most influence over its decisions. Citizens could improve their political status through business success, military service, or other achievements that increased their wealth, while the state benefited from having its most capable and committed members in positions of authority. Servius also expanded Roman citizenship to include freed slaves and foreign residents who met certain requirements, dramatically increasing the city's population while strengthening its military and economic capabilities. This policy of inclusion, building on precedents established by his predecessors, continued Rome's evolution toward becoming a truly cosmopolitan society that valued contribution over origin. The king's military reforms proved equally revolutionary, as he reorganized the Roman army according to the new class system while introducing tactical innovations borrowed from Greek warfare. The manipular system he established would eventually evolve into the legendary legion that conquered the Mediterranean world, while his emphasis on discipline, training, and standardized equipment created professional military capabilities that far exceeded anything Rome had previously achieved. Servius's building projects continued the urban transformation that Tarquinius Priscus had begun, but with greater emphasis on defensive fortifications that reflected Rome's growing wealth and the envy it inspired among neighboring powers. The Servian Wall, a massive fortification system that enclosed all 7 hills within a single defensive perimeter, demonstrated both Rome's engineering capabilities and its determination to protect the prosperity it had achieved. These walls, constructed with enormous blocks of tufa stone and featuring sophisticated gate systems and defensive towers, created a protected area large enough to accommodate continued population growth while providing security against any conceivable enemy force. The project required unprecedented coordination of labor and resources, while its completion announced to the entire Italian peninsula that Rome had become a permanent fixture in the regional balance of power. The king's religious innovations proved equally significant for Rome's long-term development, as he established new temples and festivals that honored both traditional Roman deities and foreign gods whose worship had spread throughout the city's increasingly diverse population. The Temple of Diana on the Aventine Hill, modeled after the famous shrine at Ephesus, attracted worshippers from throughout central Italy while symbolizing Rome's growing cultural sophistication. This religious inclusiveness reflected the broader openness that characterized Servian policies, as the king consistently sought to incorporate useful innovations regardless of their origins, while maintaining the essential institutions that preserved Roman identity. His reign demonstrated that tradition and innovation could coexist productively when guided by leaders who understood both the value of established customs and the necessity of adapting to changing circumstances. The prosperity and stability that marked most of Servius's reign created conditions for remarkable cultural and economic development that positioned Rome for the dramatic expansion that would follow. Trade relationships extended throughout the Mediterranean, bringing both wealth and new ideas that stimulated innovation in technology, arts, and political organization. Roman merchants established trading posts in ports from Spain to Asia Minor, while foreign traders set up permanent operations in Rome's expanding commercial districts. This economic integration created prosperity that benefited all social classes while providing the resources necessary for continued military expansion and urban development. But the very success of Servian policies created tensions that would ultimately destroy both the king and the monarchical system he had worked so hard to perfect. His reforms had elevated many previously marginalized groups while reducing the relative influence of traditional aristocratic families who traced their prominence to Rome's earliest days. These tensions came to a head through the ambitions of Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, the son of Tarquinius Priscus, who believed that his father's throne had been unjustly usurped by Servius Tullius. Unlike the unsuccessful conspiracy that had eliminated his father, Tarquinius Superbus employed patient political maneuvering that gradually built support among disaffected nobles while undermining confidence in the existing regime. The conspiracy that brought down Servius Tullius in 535 BCE represented more than a simple palace coup. It reflected deeper conflicts between competing visions of Roman society and governance that would continue to influence Roman politics throughout the Republic and Empire. The king's assassination marked not only the end of his personal reign, but the beginning of the final crisis that would destroy the monarchical system and lead to the establishment of the Roman Republic. The reign of Lucius Tarquinius Superbus began with all the ceremony and legitimacy that Roman tradition demanded. Yet beneath the surface lurked the seeds of destruction that would ultimately topple not just this king, but the entire monarchical system that had governed Rome for over 2 centuries. His very name, Superbus, meaning the proud, would become synonymous with tyranny in Roman memory, though initially his subjects knew him simply as the rightful heir to his father's achievements and the natural successor to Servius Tullius's progressive policies. Tarquinius Superbus possessed many of the qualities that had made his father successful. He understood engineering and military tactics, appreciated the importance of public works and religious ceremonies, and recognized the value of expanding Roman influence throughout central Italy. His early years as king saw continued prosperity and territorial growth that seemed to vindicate the violent means by which he had seized power. The new king's first priority involved consolidating his authority by eliminating potential rivals and rewarding those nobles who had supported his coup against Servius Tullius. This required delicate political maneuvering that balanced the need for security against the risk of appearing vindictive or tyrannical. He redistributed lands confiscated from Servius's supporters to his own followers while maintaining most of the constitutional and military reforms that had strengthened Roman capabilities. But gradually, the character flaws that would earn him his infamous epithet began to manifest themselves in policies that prioritized royal prerogatives over constitutional traditions. Unlike his predecessors, who had consistently consulted the Senate and respected the advisory role of Rome's elder statesmen, Tarquinius Superbus increasingly made unilateral decisions that bypassed traditional deliberative processes. The king's building projects, while impressive in scale and ambition, were financed through increasingly burdensome taxation that fell most heavily on ordinary citizens who lacked the political connections to secure exemptions. The completion of the Temple of Jupiter, Optimus Maximus, that magnificent structure begun by his father, required enormous expenditures of both money and labor that strained Roman resources, while providing few tangible benefits to the citizens who bore the costs. More troubling still, the king began employing methods of enforcement that violated the legal protections Romans had come to expect under previous rulers. Citizens who questioned royal policies found themselves facing arbitrary punishment without the formal trials that Roman law traditionally guaranteed. Property could be confiscated on royal whim, while military service became increasingly coercive rather than the civic duty it had been under earlier kings. These domestic policies created growing resentment among Romans of all social classes, but it was foreign policy that provided the catalyst for the revolution that would transform Rome forever. The king's military campaigns, while initially successful, gradually evolved from defensive wars aimed at protecting Roman interests into aggressive conquests designed primarily to enhance royal prestige and fill the royal treasury. The siege of Ardea, a wealthy Latin city that had committed no offense against Rome beyond possessing resources that Tarquinius Superbus coveted, became the setting for the personal drama that would ignite the broader political revolution brewing throughout Roman society. The prolonged siege provided ample opportunity for the idle conversation and competitive boasting that characterized military camps during periods of reduced activity. Among the young nobles serving in the royal army was Sextus Tarquinius, the king's son, whose character combined his father's arrogance with a cruel streak that had already earned him notoriety among Rome's aristocratic families. During one evening of drinking and boasting, the conversation turned to the virtue and beauty of the officers' wives, each man praising his own spouse while disparaging his companion's choices. Lucius Tarquinius Collatinus, a cousin of the royal family, proposed that they settle the dispute through direct observation rather than mere argument. The group could ride to Rome and surprise their wives, evaluating firsthand which woman proved most worthy of her husband's praise and devotion. The suggestion appealed to their competitive spirits and provided welcome relief from the tedium of siege warfare. When the party arrived unannounced at the homes of various nobles, they found most wives engaged in frivolous entertainments with friends, drinking wine and gossiping about court scandals, rather than attending to domestic duties or maintaining the dignity appropriate to their stations. But at the modest home of Collatinus, in the nearby town of Collatia, they discovered a scene that stood in stark contrast to the dissipation they had witnessed elsewhere. Lucretia, wife of Collatinus, was discovered working by lamplight with her servants, spinning wool and weaving cloth, while discussing household management and the welfare of servants and dependents. Her beauty, enhanced rather than diminished by her simple clothing and serious demeanor, impressed all the visitors as representing the ideal of Roman womanhood that their society claimed to honor above all other virtues. Sextus Tarquinius, viewing this paragon of virtue and beauty, felt desires that quickly transformed from admiration into obsession. The very qualities that made Lucretia admirable to others became, in his corrupted mind, challenges to be overcome, rather than virtues to be respected. Her reputation for chastity and her devotion to her husband represented obstacles that his royal privilege should enable him to surmount through whatever means proved necessary. Several days later, Sextus returned alone to Collatia, presenting himself as a friend seeking hospitality while traveling on royal business. Lucretia, bound by the sacred duties of hospitality and unaware of his true intentions, welcomed him into her home and provided the entertainment appropriate to his rank and family connections. After the household had retired for the evening, the prince made his way to Lucretia's private chambers. What followed became the foundational crime that transformed personal tragedy into political revolution. Sextus threatened Lucretia with death if she refused his demands, but when she declared her willingness to die rather than betray her marriage vows, he employed a threat more devastating than mere murder. He would kill her and place a male slave's body beside hers, then claim he had discovered them in adultery and executed them for their crimes against Roman morality. This threat struck at the very heart of what Romans valued most highly: reputation, family honor, and the integrity of the household as the foundation of civilized society. Death would have preserved Lucretia's honor while making her a martyr to virtue, but the false accusation of adultery would destroy not only her memory, but her family's standing for generations to come. Faced with this impossible choice between personal violation and family destruction, Lucretia submitted to the prince's demands while planning the course of action that would transform her personal tragedy into the catalyst for political transformation. The next morning, after Sextus had departed, she sent urgent messages to her father and husband, requesting their immediate presence for a matter of the utmost importance to family honour. When Lucius Junius Brutus arrived with Collatinus and Lucretia's father, they found a woman whose dignity remained intact despite the trauma she had endured. She recounted the previous night's events with the clarity and precision that Roman legal tradition demanded, naming Sextus Tarquinius as her attacker while absolving herself of any willing participation in the crime that had been committed against her. Her listeners responded with the outrage and sympathy that such an account naturally provoked, assuring her that the guilt belonged entirely to the perpetrator rather than his unwilling victim. They promised that justice would be pursued through appropriate legal channels, while the prince would face the consequences that Roman law prescribed for such violations of hospitality and marriage bonds. But Lucretia had already determined that the contamination of her body, regardless of the circumstances that had produced it, made continued life impossible for a woman whose identity rested entirely on her chastity and moral purity. Drawing a dagger from beneath her robes, she declared that while she forgave herself of guilt, she would not provide a precedent for other women to use force as an excuse for voluntary adultery. With these words, she plunged the blade into her heart, dying instantly and transforming her personal tragedy into a political symbol that would resonate throughout Roman history. Her blood, flowing onto the floor of her family home, became the foundation for the oath that would destroy the monarchy and establish the Roman Republic. Brutus, who had previously concealed his political ambitions behind a facade of simple-minded loyalty to the royal family, revealed his true character and intentions in this moment of crisis. Drawing the bloody dagger from Lucretia's chest, he swore by her blood and the gods who witnessed mortal suffering that he would pursue not merely personal vengeance against Sextus Tarquinius, but the complete overthrow of the entire royal family and the monarchical system that had enabled such crimes. The other men, inspired by his passion and recognizing the justice of his cause, joined their oaths to his, creating the conspiracy that would transform Roman government forever. But revolution required more than noble intentions and personal outrage. It demanded careful planning, popular support, and the military capability necessary to resist the inevitable royal response to challenges against established authority. Brutus understood that success depended on presenting the Roman people with a compelling vision of alternative government that would provide greater security and prosperity than the monarchy they knew. He could not simply destroy the existing system without offering something better to replace it, or his revolution would produce only chaos that would ultimately restore royal authority under different leadership. The funeral of Lucretia became the first public demonstration against royal tyranny, as her tragic story spread throughout Rome and the surrounding territories with remarkable speed. The combination of personal sympathy for an innocent victim and political frustration with increasingly arbitrary government created conditions favourable for revolutionary action. When Brutus addressed the crowd gathered for the funeral, he spoke not merely of personal vengeance, but of fundamental principles of government that should protect all citizens from the kind of abuse that had destroyed this virtuous woman. Kings who placed their personal desires above law and custom forfeited any claim to divine sanction or popular obedience, while citizens possessed both the right and the duty to resist tyranny, through whatever means proved necessary. The political philosophy that Brutus articulated during these crucial days drew upon both Roman traditions and Greek political theory to create a framework for government that would balance efficiency with accountability. Rather than abolishing executive authority entirely, the new system would divide power among multiple officials, serving limited terms while remaining accountable to both the Senate and popular assemblies for their actions. This constitutional innovation promised to preserve the benefits of strong leadership while preventing the concentration of power that had enabled royal tyranny to develop. Citizens would enjoy legal protections that no individual could override, while the state would benefit from having multiple leaders whose competition would drive them toward excellence rather than corruption. The revolution that followed Lucretia's death succeeded not through massive popular uprising, but through careful political maneuvering that isolated the royal family while building broad support for constitutional change. Brutus and his fellow conspirators worked systematically to secure support from key military units, influential families, and regional communities whose cooperation would prove essential for establishing legitimate alternative government. When Tarquinius Superbus learned of the revolutionary movement developing in Rome, he attempted to return from the siege of Ardea with loyal troops to suppress the rebellion before it could gather sufficient momentum to threaten royal authority seriously. But he found the city gates closed against him and the walls manned by citizens who had already committed themselves to the new republican government that Brutus had proclaimed. The confrontation between the last king and the first republicans took place not through dramatic battle, but through a series of negotiations and political maneuvers that demonstrated the sophistication of Roman political culture even during periods of revolutionary transformation. Both sides understood that civil war would weaken Rome, regardless of which faction ultimately prevailed, while foreign enemies would certainly exploit internal conflicts to advance their own territorial ambitions. The compromise that emerged from these discussions reflected the practical wisdom that would characterize Roman republican government throughout its long history. Tarquinius Superbus would renounce his claim to the throne and depart from Roman territory with his family and supporters, while his property would be confiscated to compensate victims of royal oppression and fund the new government's initial operations. This peaceful resolution of the monarchical crisis enabled Rome to transition from kingdom to republic without the devastating internal warfare that typically accompanied such fundamental political changes. The year 509 BCE thus marked not only the end of royal government, but the beginning of a new form of political organization that would eventually carry Roman power throughout the civilized world. The Roman Republic that emerged from this revolution represented one of humanity's most successful experiments in constitutional government, creating institutions and precedents that would influence political development throughout the Western world for over 2 millennia. The consular system that replaced monarchical authority divided executive power between 2 officials serving 1-year terms, while the Senate provided continuity and expertise that balanced popular enthusiasm with experienced judgment. But the transition from monarchy to republic created new challenges that would test Roman political wisdom and military capabilities throughout the following centuries. Foreign enemies, encouraged by Rome's apparent weakness during the revolutionary period, began pressing against Roman territories with renewed aggression. Internal conflicts between different social classes, temporarily suppressed during the crisis that had overthrown the monarchy, resumed with increased intensity as various groups sought to maximize their advantages under the new constitutional system. The early republic would face invasions by Etruscan armies seeking to restore Tarquinius Superbus to his throne, conflicts with Latin neighbors who hoped to exploit Roman political instability, and internal struggles between patricians and plebeians that would reshape Roman society while strengthening its military capabilities. These challenges would forge the republican institutions and military traditions that would eventually enable Rome to conquer the entire Mediterranean world. The story of Lucretia's sacrifice and Brutus's revolution became foundational mythology for Roman republican culture, providing moral exemplars that would inspire Roman behavior for centuries to come. Her willingness to die rather than compromise her virtue established standards for Roman womanhood that emphasized personal honor above individual survival, while his transformation from apparent simplicity to revolutionary leadership demonstrated that true nobility derived from moral courage rather than hereditary privilege. These stories, whether historically accurate in every detail or not, expressed fundamental Roman values that would shape the character of the civilization that would emerge from the 7 hills to dominate the ancient world. The republic born from royal tyranny would carry within itself both the potential for unprecedented achievement and the seeds of its own eventual transformation into the very imperial system its founders had rejected. The expulsion of Tarquinius Superbus from Rome in 509 BCE marked not merely the end of a dynasty, but the beginning of humanity's most ambitious experiment in representative government. Yet the newborn republic faced immediate challenges that threatened to strangle it in its cradle before it could take its first breath as a free state. Foreign armies massed at the borders, internal factions schemed for advantage, and the very citizens who had cheered the monarchy's fall now questioned whether this untested system could provide the security and prosperity they had enjoyed under royal rule. Lucius Junius Brutus, the man whose revolutionary fervour had ignited the transformation from kingdom to republic, found himself confronting the harsh realities of governance that no amount of noble idealism could simply wish away. As one of the first two consuls elected to replace royal authority, he discovered that destroying tyranny proved far easier than constructing lasting freedom. The institutions he had helped create existed only on parchment and in speeches until they could demonstrate their effectiveness through successful action. The immediate crisis came from an unexpected source. Lars Porsena, the powerful Etruscan king of Clusium, had been approached by the exiled Tarquinius Superbus with promises of tribute and alliance in exchange for military support to restore the monarchy. Porsena commanded resources that dwarfed anything Rome could muster in its current weakened state. His armies included not only seasoned Etruscan warriors, but also contingents from allied cities throughout northern Italy who saw opportunity in Rome's apparent vulnerability. The Etruscan invasion that followed tested every assumption underlying the Republican experiment. Could citizen soldiers motivated by love of liberty match the fighting effectiveness of professional warriors serving autocratic masters? Would the complex deliberative processes of Republican government prove capable of making the rapid decisions that military crises demanded? Most fundamentally, did freedom provide sufficient compensation for the security and prosperity that strong monarchical government had historically delivered? The siege of Rome that Porsena conducted revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of the new political system. Republican government proved remarkably effective at mobilizing popular enthusiasm for defense of the city, as citizens who had previously served reluctantly under royal compulsion now fought with desperate courage to protect their newly won liberty. Every man understood that defeat meant not merely political subjugation, but the complete destruction of the constitutional principles for which Lucretia had died and Brutus had risked everything. Yet the same democratic processes that inspired such fierce devotion also created dangerous delays and contradictions in military planning. Consuls elected for their political skills rather than military expertise sometimes made tactical decisions that professional commanders would have avoided entirely. The Senate's traditional role as an advisory body became problematic when rapid executive action required immediate implementation rather than prolonged debate and consensus building. The legendary heroism that emerged during this crisis became foundational to Roman Republican mythology, creating examples of civic virtue that would inspire Roman behavior for centuries. Horatius Cocles, defending the Sublician Bridge against overwhelming Etruscan forces, while his comrades destroyed the span behind him, embodied the principle that individual sacrifice for collective welfare represented the highest form of patriotic service. His willingness to face certain death, rather than allow enemy forces to cross the Tiber, demonstrated that Republican citizens could achieve feats of courage that rivaled any accomplished under royal leadership. Gaius Mucius Scaevola provided another model of Republican heroism through his attempted assassination of Lars Porsena in the enemy camp. When captured after mistakenly killing the king's secretary instead of the king himself, Mucius demonstrated his contempt for torture by thrusting his right hand into a brazier and watching it burn without flinching. This act of defiant courage, he declared, represented merely the beginning of Roman resistance, as 300 other young men had sworn similar oaths to eliminate the Etruscan king through whatever means proved necessary. These displays of individual heroism served crucial propaganda purposes that extended far beyond their immediate military impact. They demonstrated to both Romans and their enemies that republican government could inspire levels of personal sacrifice and collective dedication that matched or exceeded anything achieved under monarchical authority. Citizens fighting for their own freedom possessed motivations that mercenary soldiers or reluctant subjects could never equal. The siege's resolution came through negotiation rather than decisive military victory, reflecting the complex political realities that would characterize Roman expansion throughout the Republican period. Lars Porsena recognized that even successful conquest of Rome would prove Pyrrhic if it required destroying the very prosperity and population that made the city worth conquering. Meanwhile, the Romans understood that their new government needed time to mature and strengthen before it could risk the total warfare that prolonged resistance might require. The treaty that ended the Etruscan threat established precedents for Roman diplomacy that would influence international relations throughout the Mediterranean world. Rather than demanding unconditional surrender or imposing punitive terms that would create lasting resentment, both sides negotiated agreements that acknowledged legitimate interests while providing face-saving compromises for all parties involved. Rome agreed to return captured Etruscan territory and provide hostages as guarantees of future good behavior, while Porsena withdrew his armies and recognized the legitimacy of republican government. Most importantly, the Etruscan king agreed to abandon his support for Tarquinius Superbus, effectively ending any realistic hope for monarchical restoration through foreign intervention. This diplomatic success demonstrated that republican institutions could function effectively in international relations, managing complex negotiations while maintaining both dignity and security. The Senate's collective wisdom proved valuable in evaluating treaty terms and long-term strategic implications, while consular authority provided the executive capability necessary for implementing agreed policies. But even as the Etruscan crisis receded, new challenges emerged from Rome's relationships with neighboring Latin communities that had previously accepted Roman leadership under the monarchy. These cities questioned whether republican government possessed sufficient stability and authority to maintain the alliance system that had provided mutual security and commercial prosperity throughout central Italy. The Latin War that erupted shortly after Porsena's withdrawal represented a fundamental test of republican military capabilities and political legitimacy. Unlike the Etruscan invasion, which had threatened Rome with foreign conquest, this conflict involved communities that shared cultural traditions, religious practices, and commercial interests with Rome itself. Victory required not merely military success, but political settlement that would preserve beneficial relationships while establishing republican authority. The Battle of Lake Regillus became the defining engagement of this crucial conflict, demonstrating that republican armies could achieve decisive victories against enemies who possessed comparable equipment, training, and tactical knowledge. The Roman victory resulted not from superior technology or overwhelming numbers, but from the superior morale and coordination that republican political culture had fostered among citizen soldiers. Aulus Postumius Albus, the dictator appointed to command Roman forces during this crisis, exemplified the republican principle that emergency powers could be concentrated in individual hands without destroying constitutional government, provided such authority remained temporary and subject to ultimate popular control. His successful leadership demonstrated that republican institutions could adapt to military necessities without abandoning the fundamental principles that distinguished them from monarchical alternatives. The treaty that concluded the Latin War established the framework for Roman expansion that would eventually encompass the entire Mediterranean world. Rather than ruling conquered territories as subject provinces, Rome offered alliance relationships that preserved local autonomy while ensuring strategic cooperation. Latin communities retained their traditional governments and customs while contributing military forces and accepting Roman leadership in matters affecting collective security. This federal approach to expansion solved the fundamental problem that had destroyed previous empires, how to govern distant territories without either crushing local traditions or losing central authority. Roman citizenship, initially limited to residents of the city itself, gradually expanded to include allied communities whose loyalty and service had demonstrated their commitment to Roman values and interests. The internal conflicts that emerged during the early Republic proved equally crucial for the development of Roman political culture and social institutions. The struggle between patricians and plebeians, temporarily suspended during the immediate crisis of monarchical overthrow, resumed with increased intensity as both groups sought to maximize their advantages under the new constitutional system. Patricians, descended from the original senators and aristocratic families that had governed Rome since its foundation, claimed exclusive rights to hold major magistracies and interpret religious law. Their position rested on ancestral service to the community, specialized knowledge of legal and religious traditions, and the wealth necessary to serve in public office without compensation. Plebeians, comprising the majority of Roman citizens, including farmers, craftsmen, merchants, and newer immigrants, demanded equal access to political offices and legal protections that would prevent arbitrary treatment by patrician magistrates. Their growing military importance as the backbone of Roman armies that had defended the Republic against foreign enemies provided leverage that could not be ignored indefinitely. The crisis that brought these tensions to a head occurred in 494 BCE, when plebeian soldiers refused to serve in campaigns against the Volscian Aequi until their grievances received satisfactory resolution. This military strike, known as the First Secession of the Plebs, threatened Roman security at a moment when external enemies were pressing against vulnerable frontiers. The plebeians withdrew to the Sacred Mount outside Rome, establishing their own separate community complete with magistrates, assemblies, and religious institutions that paralleled but rejected the authority of patrician-dominated government. This dramatic action demonstrated both the depth of popular dissatisfaction and the organizational capabilities that plebeian leaders had developed through military service and commercial activities. The resolution of this crisis required constitutional innovations that would permanently alter the character of Roman government, while establishing precedents for peaceful resolution of social conflicts. The creation of the tribunate of the plebs provided plebeian citizens with their own magistrates whose persons were sacred and inviolable, while their power of veto could block any government action that threatened plebeian interests. This institutional compromise demonstrated the Roman genius for constitutional adaptation that would enable the Republic to evolve and strengthen rather than fragment under internal pressures. Rather than viewing political conflict as necessarily destructive, Romans developed mechanisms that channeled competition into productive reforms while maintaining overall stability and effectiveness. The tribunes quickly became powerful advocates for plebeian interests, using their unique constitutional position to challenge patrician privileges while promoting legislation that expanded citizen rights and opportunities. Their ability to convene plebeian assemblies and propose binding legislation created alternative centers of political authority that forced patricians to negotiate rather than simply impose their will through traditional institutions. The publication of the 12 Tables in 451 BCE represented another crucial victory for plebeian political activism and Roman constitutional development. Previously, legal knowledge had remained the exclusive preserve of patrician priests who could interpret customary law according to their own interests and prejudices. Written publication of basic legal principles created standards that applied equally to all citizens, while providing predictable procedures for resolving disputes. These bronze tablets, displayed in the forum, where all citizens could consult them, established fundamental principles of Roman jurisprudence that would influence legal systems throughout the Western world. The presumption of innocence, the right to legal representation, and detailed procedures for civil and criminal cases created protections that distinguished Roman law from the arbitrary justice that characterized most ancient societies. The economic dimensions of the patrician-plebeian conflict proved equally important for Roman social development and military effectiveness. Plebeian farmers and craftsmen demanded relief from debt burdens that threatened to reduce free citizens to slavery, while also seeking access to public lands that could provide economic security for growing families. The Lex Canulaea of 445 BCE, which legalized marriage between patricians and plebeians, eliminated one of the most significant barriers to social mobility, while creating opportunities for political alliances that transcended traditional class boundaries. These mixed marriages produced children who could claim status in both communities, gradually breaking down the rigid social hierarchies that had characterized early Roman society. The admission of plebeians to major magistracies, beginning with the consulship in 366 BCE, completed the political integration that had begun with the creation of the tribunate. Plebeian consuls brought different perspectives and constituencies to executive leadership, while demonstrating that effective governance required talents that could emerge from any social background. These constitutional developments created a more inclusive and dynamic political system that could mobilize the full resources of Roman society for both domestic development and foreign expansion. Citizens who possessed genuine stakes in governmental decisions proved more willing to make the sacrifices that military service and civic duty demanded, while competition between different social groups drove innovations in law, administration, and military organization. The Roman army that emerged from these social and political transformations represented one of history's most effective military institutions, combining professional competence with civic motivation in ways that no purely mercenary or aristocratic force could match. The manipular system, developed during the 4th century BCE, provided tactical flexibility that enabled Roman forces to adapt to diverse enemies and terrain conditions, while maintaining the discipline and coordination necessary for complex operations. Roman military service became a school for citizenship that transformed young men from diverse backgrounds into disciplined soldiers and responsible citizens who understood both their rights and their obligations within the broader community. Veterans returned to civilian life with skills, experiences, and perspectives that strengthened Roman society while providing the leadership necessary for continued expansion and development. The conquest of Italy, achieved gradually through a combination of military victories and diplomatic settlements, demonstrated the effectiveness of Roman federal policies and military capabilities. Each successful campaign brought new allies whose resources strengthened Rome for subsequent challenges, while defeated enemies were offered opportunities to join the Roman system rather than face permanent subjugation. The Gallic sack of Rome in 390 BCE provided a crucial test of Roman resilience and institutional stability that ultimately strengthened rather than weakened the Republic's position in central Italy. The temporary occupation of the city by Brennus and his Celtic warriors shocked Roman confidence while demonstrating the vulnerabilities that came with increasing wealth and territorial expansion. Yet the Roman response to this catastrophe revealed the deep roots that republican institutions had developed among the citizen population. Rather than accepting defeat or seeking accommodation with the invaders, Romans organized resistance that eventually compelled the Gauls to withdraw with tribute payments that seemed modest compared to the long-term independence they preserved. The reconstruction of Rome that followed the Gallic withdrawal created opportunities for urban planning and architectural innovation that transformed the city into a worthy capital for an expanding territorial state. New fortifications, public buildings, and infrastructure projects demonstrated both Roman engineering capabilities and the prosperity that military success had generated. More importantly, the crisis prompted constitutional reforms that strengthened executive authority during emergencies, while maintaining republican safeguards against tyrannical abuse. The dictatorship, an institution that concentrated supreme power in a single individual for 6-month terms during specific crises, provided the rapid decision-making capability that military emergencies demanded without permanently altering the fundamental character of republican government. The Samnite Wars that dominated the late 4th and early 3rd centuries BCE represented Rome's most challenging military undertaking prior to the Punic conflicts with Carthage. The Samnites possessed military traditions, territorial resources, and strategic positions that enabled them to contest Roman expansion throughout south-central Italy for over 50 years of intermittent warfare. These conflicts tested Roman military innovations, diplomatic skills, and institutional resilience in ways that prepared the Republic for the greater challenges that would follow. The development of Roman road networks, military engineering capabilities, and alliance systems during the Samnite Wars created the infrastructure and expertise that would support subsequent expansion throughout the Mediterranean world. The victory over the Samnites, achieved through persistent effort rather than dramatic single battles, demonstrated the advantages that Republican government provided for long-term strategic planning and resource mobilization. Unlike monarchical systems that depended on individual rulers' capabilities and lifespans, Republican institutions could maintain consistent policies across multiple generations while adapting tactics and strategies to changing circumstances. The completion of Italian unification under Roman leadership by 264 BCE created the foundation for Mediterranean expansion that would transform Rome from a regional power into a global empire. The peninsula's diverse peoples, united under Roman federal leadership, provided the military manpower, economic resources, and naval capabilities necessary for overseas campaigns against much larger and wealthier opponents. But success in Italy also created new challenges that would test Roman institutions and character in unprecedented ways. Overseas expansion required different military strategies, administrative techniques, and diplomatic approaches than those that had proven effective in Italian campaigns. The wealth and power that came with Mediterranean dominance would create temptations for individual ambition that threatened the civic virtue and collective dedication that had made Roman success possible. The Punic Wars that began in 264 BCE represented not merely military conflicts between rival powers, but fundamental struggles for control of the Mediterranean world that would determine which civilizations' values and institutions would shape the future development of Western culture. The outcome of these conflicts would establish Rome as the dominant force in the ancient world, while creating the conditions for both the Republic's greatest achievements and its ultimate transformation into the imperial system that its founders had rejected. The Mediterranean Sea stretched before Roman ambitions like a vast blue highway, connecting the known world's greatest civilizations. Egyptian grain ships sailed alongside Phoenician merchant vessels, while Greek philosophers debated in Syracuse's Agora and Carthaginian admirals plotted in Panormus harbour. This ancient mare nostrum had witnessed the rise and fall of countless powers, yet none had possessed the combination of military innovation, political resilience, and cultural adaptability that Rome now brought to its sun-dappled waters. Sicily represented more than just another territorial prize in this emerging struggle for Mediterranean supremacy. The island commanded the narrow passages between Italy and Africa, controlling trade routes that connected the eastern and western basins of the inland sea. Wheat from its fertile valleys fed the growing populations of mainland cities, while its strategic harbours provided bases for naval operations that could project power across hundreds of miles of open water. The conflict that would reshape the ancient world began not with grand strategic planning or imperial ambition, but with a relatively minor dispute over the fate of a group of Italian mercenaries who had seized the Sicilian city of Messana. These Mamertines, sons of Mars as they called themselves, had established themselves as rulers of this crucial port through the kind of opportunistic violence that characterized the chaotic politics of Hellenistic Sicily. When Hero of Syracuse moved to eliminate this nest of brigands from his neighborhood, the desperate Mamertines made simultaneous appeals to both Rome and Carthage for protection. This seemingly local crisis suddenly became the spark that ignited a global conflict, as both great powers recognized that control of Messana would provide decisive advantages in any future struggle for Mediterranean dominance. The Roman decision to intervene in Sicily represented a fundamental departure from the cautious expansionism that had characterized Republican policy throughout the conquest of Italy. For the first time, Roman legions would cross salt water to fight on foreign soil, abandoning the defensive strategies that had served them well on the peninsula in favor of aggressive intervention in disputes that had no direct bearing on Roman security. The Senate's debates over this momentous decision revealed the tensions between traditional Republican values and the new opportunities that growing power had created. Conservative senators argued that overseas adventures would corrupt Roman character while stretching military resources beyond safe limits. They pointed to the fate of Athens, whose imperial ambitions had ultimately destroyed the democracy that had made those ambitions possible. But younger senators, many of them veterans of the Italian campaigns, saw Sicily as the natural next step in Rome's inevitable expansion. The island's wealth could fund further military improvements, while its strategic position would provide security against future threats from either Carthage or the Greek kingdoms of the eastern Mediterranean. Victory would demonstrate Roman capabilities to potential enemies, while providing opportunities for glory and enrichment that domestic campaigns could no longer offer. The decision to support the Mamertines passed by the narrowest of margins, setting in motion events that would ultimately determine whether Rome or Carthage would dominate the Western world. The consul Appius Claudius Caudex crossed the Strait of Messina with an advance force in 264 BCE, beginning the First Punic War that would test Roman endurance and innovation for nearly a quarter century. Carthage entered this conflict with advantages that seemed to guarantee victory over the upstart Italian Republic. The Phoenician city commanded naval forces that had dominated Mediterranean waters for centuries, while their wealth exceeded anything Rome could hope to mobilize. Carthaginian merchants operated trading posts from Spain to Cyprus, generating revenues that supported professional armies and subsidized allied cities throughout the Western Basin. The Carthaginian military system relied on expertise rather than patriotism, employing specialists recruited from throughout the known world, rather than citizen soldiers motivated by love of homeland. Balearic slingers, Numidian cavalry, Spanish infantry, and Celtic warriors served under Carthaginian commanders who understood logistics, engineering, and tactics in ways that Roman generals were only beginning to learn. Yet these apparent advantages concealed fundamental weaknesses that would ultimately prove decisive in the long struggle ahead. Carthaginian forces, however skilled individually, lacked the cohesion and dedication that came from fighting for one's own soil and institutions. Mercenary soldiers served for pay rather than principle, making them vulnerable to demoralization when campaigns turned difficult or pay became irregular. More significantly, Carthage's commercial empire depended on maintaining profitable relationships with diverse client states and trading partners whose loyalty remained conditional on continued prosperity. Military setbacks that disrupted trade networks could trigger cascading political crises that threatened the entire foundation of Carthaginian power. Rome's initial disadvantages in naval warfare became apparent immediately when Carthaginian fleets began intercepting supply convoys and raiding the Italian coast with impunity. Roman armies might dominate land battles through superior discipline and tactics, but they remained helpless when Carthaginian ships controlled the sea lanes that connected Sicily to the mainland. The Roman response to this challenge demonstrated the innovative pragmatism that would characterize their approach to problems throughout their imperial expansion. Rather than accepting permanent naval inferiority, they committed the Republic's full resources to creating a fleet that could match Carthaginian capabilities through sheer determination and engineering ingenuity. The construction of Rome's first major naval force represented an unprecedented mobilization of resources and expertise that transformed the Republic's military capabilities within a single generation. Roman engineers studied captured Carthaginian vessels to understand design principles they had never encountered, while Roman craftsmen learned shipbuilding techniques that had been perfected over centuries of Mediterranean navigation. The famous corvus, That boarding bridge, which Roman ingenuity added to their warships, exemplified the creative adaptation that enabled Roman success in unfamiliar environments. Since Romans could not match Carthaginian seamanship in traditional naval maneuvers, they transformed sea battles into land conflicts by creating mechanisms that allowed their superior infantry to engage enemy crews in direct combat. Marcus Atilius Regulus emerged as the hero of Rome's early naval victories, demonstrating that Roman virtues of courage and persistence could triumph over Carthaginian wealth and experience when properly applied. His victories at Mylae and Ecnomus established Roman naval credibility while providing the confidence necessary for even more ambitious operations. The invasion of Africa that Regulus led in 256 BCE represented the first time Roman legions had fought on foreign continents, marking another milestone in the Republic's evolution from regional power to global empire. The initial successes of this campaign, which brought Roman forces to the gates of Carthage itself, demonstrated the potential for Roman arms to achieve victories that had seemed impossible just decades earlier. Yet Regulus's ultimate defeat and capture revealed the dangers that came with overextending Roman resources in pursuit of quick, decisive victories. His refusal to recommend peace terms that would spare him personal suffering, while potentially disadvantaging Roman interests, became legendary examples of republican virtue triumphing over individual survival instincts. The story of Regulus's return to Rome as a Carthaginian ambassador, bound by oath to recommend acceptance of enemy peace proposals, provided moral instruction that would influence Roman behavior for centuries. His speech to the Senate, arguing against the very terms that would secure his release, demonstrated the priority of collective welfare over personal interest that republican ideology demanded from its greatest citizens. When Regulus returned to Carthage to face the tortuous death that his refusal to recommend surrender had guaranteed, he became a martyr to republican principles whose example would inspire Roman resistance during subsequent crises. His sacrifice demonstrated that individual Romans could achieve moral greatness that transcended mere military or political success. The war's continuation after Regulus's defeat settled into the grinding attrition that would characterize much of the conflict's remaining duration. Neither side possessed the decisive advantages necessary for quick victory, while both commands the resources to sustain prolonged resistance despite repeated setbacks and enormous casualties. Roman persistence during this period of stalemate demonstrated the institutional strengths that would ultimately enable republican victory over seemingly superior opponents. The Senate's collective wisdom provided strategic continuity across multiple consulships, while the citizen assemblies maintained popular support for military efforts that demanded unprecedented sacrifices from ordinary Romans. The siege of Lilybaeum became symbolic of the entire conflict's character, as Roman forces invested enormous resources in capturing a fortress whose strategic value barely justified the costs required for its reduction. Yet the psychological importance of demonstrating that no Carthaginian position could resist indefinite Roman pressure ultimately proved more significant than immediate tactical advantages. Gaius Lutatius Catulus finally achieved the decisive naval victory at the Aegates Islands in 241 BCE that forced Carthage to seek peace on Roman terms. His success resulted not from superior seamanship or technological innovation, but from the systematic preparation and resource commitment that Roman institutional strengths made possible. The treaty that ended the First Punic War established Rome as the dominant power in the Western Mediterranean while providing precedents for the imperial expansion that would follow. Sicily became Rome's first provincia, that territorial command which Roman magistrates would govern according to Roman law, while extracting resources that supported further military operations. The Carthaginian evacuation of Sicily left behind a power vacuum that Rome filled through the familiar combination of military occupation and diplomatic accommodation that had proven successful throughout the Italian campaigns. Greek cities retained their traditional autonomy under Roman protection, while former Carthaginian territories were organized according to Roman administrative principles. Yet victory in the First Punic War created new challenges that would test Roman character and institutions in ways that domestic Italian conflicts never had. The wealth flowing from Sicilian tribute and trade created opportunities for personal enrichment that threatened the civic virtue and collective dedication that had made Roman success possible. The mercenary war that convulsed Carthage immediately after the Roman victory revealed both the weaknesses of the Punic system and the opportunities that Roman expansion had created. Carthaginian inability to pay their soldiers' wages triggered rebellions that threatened to destroy their empire from within, while Rome watched from across the strait with growing confidence in their own institutional superiority. Roman seizure of Sardinia and Corsica during Carthage's domestic crisis demonstrated that republican government could act with the same opportunistic ruthlessness that characterized monarchical expansion, while maintaining the legal and moral justifications that preserved citizen support for aggressive policies. The 20-year interwar period that followed witnessed dramatic developments in both Roman and Carthaginian capabilities that would shape the even more devastating conflict to come. Rome consolidated its control over northern Italy through campaigns against Gallic tribes that provided military training for a new generation of officers, while securing the land routes that connected the city to its Alpine frontiers. Carthaginian expansion in Spain under Hamilcar Barca and his successors created new sources of wealth and military recruitment that more than compensated for the losses suffered in the First Punic War. Spanish silver funded military improvements, while Spanish soldiers provided the infantry backbone for armies that would soon challenge Roman supremacy throughout the Mediterranean world. The siege of Saguntum in 219 BCE provided the immediate cause for renewed conflict, though both sides had been preparing for the inevitable resumption of their struggle for Mediterranean dominance. Hannibal's attack on Rome's Spanish ally created the legal justification for Roman intervention, while his subsequent actions would transform a regional dispute into an existential crisis for the Roman Republic. The young Carthaginian commander, who would soon terrorize Italy, possessed military genius that combined tactical innovation with strategic vision in ways that no Roman general had yet encountered. His multicultural army, welded together through years of Spanish campaigning, represented the most formidable military instrument that had threatened Roman security since the Republic's foundation. The decision to march this force across the Alps rather than transport it by sea demonstrated both Hannibal's tactical brilliance and his understanding of Roman vulnerabilities. An overland invasion would allow him to recruit Gallic allies while avoiding the naval battles where Roman improvements had eliminated Carthaginian advantages. The crossing itself became one of history's most audacious military enterprises, as Hannibal led elephants, cavalry, and infantry across mountain passes that had never witnessed such ambitious expeditions. The losses suffered during this journey reduced his force significantly, yet the psychological impact of his arrival in the Po Valley more than compensated for numerical disadvantages. Roman assumptions about Carthaginian capabilities and intentions proved catastrophically incorrect, as Hannibal's victories at Ticinus and Trebia shattered the legions that had confidently advanced to meet what they assumed would be another conventional campaign. The speed and completeness of these defeats revealed gaps in Roman military doctrine that no previous enemies had been capable of exploiting. The disaster at Lake Trasimene demonstrated that individual Roman courage and traditional tactical formations could not overcome superior generalship when facing enemies who understood Romans' strengths and weaknesses better than Romans understood themselves. Consul Gaius Flaminius led 15,000 men into a carefully prepared ambush that eliminated an entire consular army within a few hours of fighting. News of this catastrophe reached Rome like thunder preceding a devastating storm, as citizens realized that their city faced enemies capable of achievements that no previous generation of Romans had been forced to contemplate. The appointment of Quintus Fabius Maximus as dictator represented recognition that extraordinary circumstances required extraordinary measures that transcended normal constitutional limitations. Fabius's strategy of avoiding direct confrontation while harassing Carthaginian forces and denying them decisive victory became known as the Fabian approach to warfare that would influence military thinking throughout subsequent history. His patience and strategic wisdom preserved Roman military capability during the Republic's darkest hour, though his methods attracted criticism from citizens who preferred dramatic action to careful calculation. The Battle of Cannae in 216 BCE represented the climax of Hannibal's tactical genius and the nadir of Roman military fortunes, as 80,000 Roman soldiers faced annihilation in a single afternoon through the most complete tactical defeat in military history. The double envelopment that Hannibal achieved through superior positioning and troop coordination eliminated the largest army Rome had ever assembled. Yet even this unprecedented disaster could not break Roman determination to continue resistance, despite losses that would have forced any other ancient state to seek immediate peace. The Senate's refusal to ransom captured soldiers demonstrated the harsh discipline that Republican ideology demanded, while the decision to continue fighting despite overwhelming odds revealed the institutional strength that would ultimately enable Roman victory. The aftermath of Cannae witnessed defections among Rome's Italian allies that threatened to unravel the federal system that had taken centuries to construct. Cities throughout southern Italy, convinced that Roman power had been permanently broken, declared for Carthage in hopes of securing favorable treatment from what appeared to be the inevitable victor. But the majority of Rome's allies remained loyal, despite Carthaginian victories and inducements, demonstrating that Roman federal policies had created genuine bonds of mutual interest and shared identity that could survive even the most severe military setbacks. The decision of most Italian communities to continue supporting Rome revealed the strength of the political relationships that had been carefully constructed throughout the conquest of the peninsula. Roman recovery from the disasters of 218 to 216 BCE required fundamental changes in military organization, strategic doctrine, and resource mobilization that would transform the Republic's capabilities for all subsequent conflicts. The citizen militia that had served adequately for Italian campaigns proved inadequate for the prolonged overseas operations that Mediterranean warfare demanded. The development of professional military capabilities during the Hannibalic War created the institutional foundations for the imperial expansion that would follow. Roman soldiers gained experience in diverse theatres and tactical situations that prepared them for the challenges they would face in subsequent campaigns against Macedonian phalanxes, Seleucid armies, and Gallic warrior bands. Marcus Claudius Marcellus earned recognition as the Sword of Rome through his aggressive tactics against Carthaginian forces in Sicily and southern Italy, demonstrating that Roman commanders could adapt their methods to counter Hannibalic innovations while maintaining the offensive spirit that had characterized Roman warfare since the Republic's foundation. The siege of Syracuse became a defining moment in Roman military development, as Marcellus's forces overcame defensive innovations created by Archimedes himself, while establishing Roman supremacy over the Greek cities that had dominated Mediterranean civilization for centuries. The fall of this legendary city announced Rome's emergence as the heir to Hellenistic culture, as well as its military conqueror. Publius Cornelius Scipio emerged as the Roman commander, whose genius could match Hannibal's tactical innovations, while exploiting Roman institutional advantages that the Carthaginian system could not replicate. His victories in Spain demonstrated that Roman arms could achieve decisive success against Carthaginian forces when led by commanders who understood both traditional Roman strengths and new tactical requirements. The Battle of Zama in 202 BCE brought the Second Punic War to its climactic conclusion, as Scipio's African campaign forced Carthage to recall Hannibal from Italy while creating the conditions for final Roman victory. The irony that Hannibal's first decisive defeat came at the hands of a Roman general who had learned his tactical lessons from studying Carthaginian methods was lost on neither commander. The peace treaty that ended the Second Punic War established Roman hegemony throughout the Western Mediterranean, while reducing Carthage to a client state whose continued existence depended entirely on Roman tolerance. The massive indemnity imposed ensured that Carthaginian resources would serve Roman interests for the foreseeable future, while territorial restrictions prevented any revival of Punic naval power. Yet victory over Carthage created new challenges that would test republican institutions and character in ways that military defeat never could. The wealth flowing from conquered territories provided opportunities for individual enrichment that threatened the civic virtue and collective dedication that had made Roman success possible, while the responsibilities of governing diverse Mediterranean peoples required administrative capabilities that the city-state constitution had never been designed to provide. The echoes of Roman triumph over Carthage had barely faded when new challenges emerged from the eastern Mediterranean, where Hellenistic kingdoms ruled by the successors of Alexander the Great watched Rome's rising power with growing alarm. These monarchs, inheritors of 3 centuries of Greek military tradition and cultural sophistication, commanded resources and territories that dwarfed even Carthage at its height. Yet their very greatness would prove to be their undoing, as Roman pragmatism and institutional resilience systematically dismantled the elaborate political structures that had governed the Eastern world since Alexander's death. Philip V of Macedon had made the fatal error of allying with Hannibal during Rome's darkest hour, sending embassies to the Carthaginian general and promising military support that never materialized in meaningful quantities. This diplomatic miscalculation provided Rome with the legal justification needed to intervene in Greek affairs, transforming what had been a Western Mediterranean conflict into a global struggle for supremacy over the entire ancient world. The Romans who crossed the Adriatic Sea in 200 BCE to confront Macedonian power brought with them military innovations forged in the crucible of the Hannibalic War. These legions had learned to adapt their tactics to counter diverse enemies, while their commanders possessed strategic flexibility that the rigid phalanx formations of Hellenistic armies could not match. More importantly, they carried with them the unshakable confidence that came from having survived Rome's greatest crisis and emerged stronger than ever. The Battle of Cynocephalae in 197 BCE demonstrated the tactical superiority that Roman military evolution had achieved over traditional Greek warfare. Titus Quinctius Flamininus deployed his legions with the fluid adaptability that characterized Roman tactical doctrine, allowing individual maniples to exploit opportunities that the inflexible Macedonian phalanx could not respond to effectively. When Philip's forces broke and fled, they carried with them the reputation for invincibility that Macedonian arms had maintained since the days of Alexander himself. Yet Flamininus's declaration of Greek freedom at the Isthmian Games revealed the sophisticated political strategy that lay behind Roman military intervention. Rather than establishing direct rule over conquered territories, Rome offered liberation from Macedonian hegemony while creating a network of grateful client states whose independence depended entirely on continued Roman protection. This approach solved the fundamental problem of governing distant territories while maximizing political advantages and minimizing administrative burdens. The Greek cities that celebrated their liberation from Macedonian rule discovered that Roman freedom came with obligations and limitations that gradually transformed their nominal independence into effective subordination. Roman commissioners supervised their internal affairs, while Roman merchants established commercial relationships that integrated Greek economies into broader Mediterranean networks controlled from Rome itself. Antiochus III of Syria, known to his subjects as Antiochus the Great, commanded an empire that stretched from the Aegean Sea to the borders of India, making him the most powerful monarch in the Hellenistic world. His decision to challenge Roman expansion into Greek affairs reflected both legitimate concerns about growing Roman influence and dangerous misunderstandings about the nature of Roman power and determination. The Syrian king's alliance with Hannibal, who had found refuge at the Seleucid court after Carthage's defeat, provided symbolic continuity with the previous struggle, while demonstrating that Rome's enemies remained capable of cooperation against their common threat. Yet this partnership between the greatest Carthaginian general and the mightiest Hellenistic monarch would prove inadequate against Roman military and political capabilities that had been strengthened rather than weakened by previous conflicts. The Roman invasion of Asia Minor in 190 BCE marked another watershed moment in Mediterranean history, as Western armies crossed into the heartland of Hellenistic civilization for the first time since Alexander's conquests 3 centuries earlier. Lucius Cornelius Scipio, brother of the victor of Zama, commanded Roman forces that would determine whether Greek culture would remain politically independent or become subject to Roman authority. The Battle of Magnesia delivered a crushing defeat to Seleucid forces that had seemed invincible just months earlier, demonstrating once again that Roman tactical flexibility and institutional strength could overcome apparently superior numbers and resources. Antiochus's elaborate army, including war elephants, scythed chariots, and exotic troops from throughout his vast empire, collapsed before the disciplined advance of Roman legions that had learned to counter every tactical innovation their enemies could deploy. The peace treaty imposed upon Antiochus revealed Roman diplomatic sophistication that matched their military capabilities. Rather than attempting to govern his vast territories directly, Rome demanded enormous indemnities that would fund future military operations, while requiring the surrender of strategic territories that threatened Roman allies. The king retained most of his empire, but lost the ability to challenge Roman hegemony in the Mediterranean world. These eastern victories created unprecedented wealth flows that transformed Roman society in ways that no previous generation had experienced or anticipated. Gold and silver from royal treasuries filled Roman coffers, while exotic goods and skilled craftsmen introduced new standards of luxury and sophistication that challenged traditional republican values of simplicity and self-discipline. The cultural contact between Roman conquerors and Greek civilization produced intellectual and artistic developments that would influence Western culture for millennia to come. Roman aristocrats discovered philosophy, rhetoric, and artistic traditions that seemed to offer deeper satisfaction than the practical pursuits that had previously occupied their attention, while Greek intellectuals found new patrons whose power exceeded anything the Hellenistic kingdoms had been able to provide. Yet these cultural borrowings occurred within a framework of clear political dominance that left no doubt about which civilization would determine the future development of Mediterranean society. Romans adopted Greek learning while maintaining Roman institutions, creating a synthesis that preserved the political structures that had made conquest possible, while enriching them with intellectual achievements that Greek independence had produced. The Third Punic War, which began in 149 BCE, represented the final resolution of the Carthaginian question that had dominated Roman strategic thinking for over a century. Marcus Porcius Cato's famous declaration that Carthage must be destroyed reflected growing Roman conviction that permanent peace required the complete elimination of potential rivals rather than their continued existence under Roman supervision. The siege of Carthage that Scipio Aemilianus conducted from 149 to 146 BCE demonstrated both Roman engineering capabilities and the ruthless determination that had characterized their approach to existential threats throughout their history. The systematic destruction of a city that had been Rome's greatest rival sent unmistakable messages to other potential enemies about the consequences of challenging Roman supremacy. The complete destruction of Carthage, followed by the ritual cursing of its site and the symbolic ploughing of salt into its foundations, represented more than military victory or even political triumph. It marked the psychological transformation of Rome from a defensive republic protecting Italian territories into an aggressive empire that would tolerate no challenges to its global dominance. The simultaneous destruction of Corinth in the same year eliminated the last center of Greek resistance, while demonstrating that Roman power could reach into the heartland of classical civilization itself. These twin catastrophes of 146 BCE marked the definitive end of the multipolar Mediterranean world that had existed since the Bronze Age collapse, replacing it with Roman hegemony that would endure for centuries. The vast territories and enormous wealth that flowed from these conquests created challenges that the Roman constitution had never been designed to address. Provincial commands provided opportunities for individual enrichment and political advancement that threatened the collective ethos that had made Roman success possible, while the responsibilities of governing diverse peoples required administrative capabilities that city-state institutions could barely provide. The emergence of powerful military commanders, whose personal loyalties transcended traditional institutional boundaries, represented a fundamental threat to republican government that would only grow more dangerous as Roman expansion continued. Men like Scipio Africanus and Scipio Aemilianus achieved personal fame and popular devotion that rivaled the authority of traditional magistrates, while their veteran soldiers developed loyalties that centered on individual commanders rather than abstract constitutional principles. The Gracchian crisis that erupted in 133 BCE revealed how conquest had transformed Roman society in ways that threatened the very foundations of republican government. Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus proposed land redistribution programs that would address the economic disruptions caused by prolonged military service and competition from slave-worked estates. But his methods of advancing these proposals violated constitutional traditions that had governed Roman politics for centuries. The violent death of Tiberius Gracchus at the hands of senators who viewed his populist appeals as demagogic threats to established order marked the first time that political disputes had resulted in bloodshed within the city itself. This precedent would prove catastrophic for republican institutions, as subsequent political leaders would increasingly resort to violence rather than persuasion to advance their causes. Gaius Sempronius Gracchus continued his brother's populist program with even more radical proposals that sought to redistribute the benefits of conquest more broadly throughout Roman society. His grain law, which provided subsidized food distributions to urban citizens, created the foundation for the bread and circuses policies that would characterize imperial government, while his judicial reforms transferred control over extortion courts from senators to equestrian jurors whose commercial interests often conflicted with traditional aristocratic values. The political coalition that Gaius assembled, combining urban plebeians with Italian allies seeking Roman citizenship, demonstrated the potential for alternative power structures that could challenge senatorial authority through popular assemblies and tribunician legislation. Yet his violent death in 121 BCE proved that traditional elites retained sufficient power to suppress challenges to their dominance, at least temporarily. The Jugurthine War that began in 111 BCE exposed the corruption and incompetence that conquest had bred within the Roman governing class, while providing the political platform that enabled Gaius Marius to emerge as the dominant military figure of his generation. The prolonged difficulties that Roman forces experienced against a relatively minor Numidian king revealed how provincial commands had become opportunities for personal enrichment rather than effective military leadership. Marius's military reforms, implemented during his consulships in the early 1st century BCE, transformed Roman military organization in ways that would have profound consequences for republican government. His decision to recruit soldiers from the landless urban poor, rather than property-owning farmers, created professional armies whose loyalty centered on their commanders rather than the state, while his promise of land grants to veterans upon completion of service made military commanders responsible for their soldiers' economic welfare. These changes created more effective military instruments for overseas campaigns, while fundamentally altering the relationship between civilian and military authority that had characterized republican government since its foundation. Professional soldiers served for decades rather than single campaigns, developing skills and unit cohesion that citizen militias could never achieve. Yet their extended service isolated them from civilian society, while creating dependencies that ambitious commanders could exploit for political purposes. The social war that erupted in 91 BCE represented the logical conclusion of Roman expansion policies that had created a complex hierarchy of citizenship rights and obligations throughout the Italian peninsula. Rome's Italian allies, who had provided the military manpower that made Mediterranean conquest possible, demanded full citizenship rights that would give them equal voice in decisions about how to govern and benefit from the empire they had helped create. The violent conflict that followed demonstrated both the strength of Roman military institutions and the dangers of excluding loyal populations from full participation in imperial government. Italian communities possessed military capabilities that matched Roman standards, having served alongside Roman legions for centuries, while their knowledge of Roman tactical methods made them formidable opponents when those methods were turned against Rome itself. The resolution of the social war, through the extension of Roman citizenship to all Italian communities, represented a crucial expansion of the Roman political community that strengthened the empire while creating new challenges for republican institutions designed to govern a single city-state. The integration of hundreds of thousands of new citizens into existing tribal and assembly structures strained administrative capabilities while creating opportunities for political manipulation that ambitious leaders would soon exploit. Lucius Cornelius Sulla's march on Rome in 88 BCE shattered the fundamental constitutional principle that had governed republican politics since its foundation, that Roman armies would never be used against Roman citizens within the city itself. His seizure of the capital with veteran legions demonstrated how military reforms had created instruments that could be turned against the very government they were supposed to protect. The proscription lists that Sulla published during his dictatorship introduced systematic political murder as a tool of government, while his constitutional reforms attempted to restore senatorial authority by eliminating the powers that popular leaders had used to challenge aristocratic dominance. Yet these measures proved temporary solutions to problems that were rooted in the fundamental contradictions between republican institutions and imperial responsibilities. The slave revolt, led by Spartacus from 73 to 71 BCE, revealed another consequence of conquest that threatened Roman security from within. The enormous slave populations that worked the agricultural estates of southern Italy possessed military capabilities derived from their origins as prisoners of war, while their desperation provided motivation that citizen soldiers often lacked. The prolonged difficulties that Roman forces experienced against these escaped slaves demonstrated how conquest had created vulnerabilities that no external enemy could exploit as effectively as Rome's own victims. The eventual suppression of the revolt required mobilization of resources comparable to those deployed in major foreign wars, while the crucifixion of 6,000 captured rebels along the Via Appia provided a brutal reminder of the violence that sustained Roman prosperity. Marcus Licinius Crassus emerged from the Spartacus campaign as one of Rome's wealthiest and most powerful individuals, yet his subsequent defeat and death at the hands of Parthian forces in 53 BCE demonstrated the limits of Roman military capabilities when extended beyond the Mediterranean basin. The destruction of his army at Carrhae represented Rome's most significant military disaster since Cannae, while the capture of Roman eagles by Eastern enemies provided symbols of humiliation that would haunt Roman pride for generations. The first triumvirate formed by Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus in 60 BCE represented an attempt to manage the challenges of imperial government through private agreements among powerful individuals rather than through traditional constitutional mechanisms. This informal alliance enabled its members to divide provincial commands and political offices according to their mutual interests, while bypassing the Senate and popular assemblies that had previously controlled such decisions. Julius Caesar's conquest of Gaul from 58 to 50 BCE demonstrated the military capabilities that individual commanders could achieve when given unlimited resources and extended time to develop their strategies. His systematic subjugation of Celtic tribes from the Rhine to the Atlantic created the territorial foundation for European civilization, while providing Caesar with the wealth, military reputation, and veteran loyalty necessary to challenge any rival for supreme power within the Roman system. The Gallic Wars also revealed the cultural arrogance that had become characteristic of Roman attitudes toward conquered peoples. As Caesar's commentaries describe the destruction of entire communities and the enslavement of hundreds of thousands of inhabitants as routine aspects of Roman civilizing mission, the siege of Alesia, where Vercingetorix made his final stand against Roman expansion, became a symbol of heroic resistance that would inspire later nationalist movements, while its outcome demonstrated the inexorable advance of Roman power across the European continent. The civil war that erupted between Caesar and Pompey in 49 BCE represented the final crisis of republican government, as the two most powerful Romans of their generation abandoned constitutional methods in favor of armed conflict that would determine the future structure of Mediterranean civilization. Caesar's crossing of the Rubicon with his veteran legions marked the point of no return in the Republic's transformation, while his famous declaration that the die was cast acknowledged that traditional government had become impossible. The speed and decisiveness of Caesar's victory in this conflict demonstrated how military reforms had concentrated power in the hands of individual commanders while weakening the institutional structures that had previously balanced competing interests within Roman society. Pompey's defeat at Pharsalus in 48 BCE eliminated the last credible defender of traditional republican governments, while Caesar's subsequent victories in Africa and Spain destroyed all remaining centers of senatorial resistance. Caesar's brief dictatorship from 49 to 44 BCE revealed both the potential benefits and inherent dangers of concentrated power within Roman political culture. His administrative reforms addressed many of the problems that had paralyzed republican government, while his building projects and public entertainments demonstrated the resources that effective leadership could mobilize for popular benefit. Yet, his assassination on the Ides of March 44th BCE proved that republican traditions retained sufficient strength to inspire desperate resistance to monarchical government, even when that government provided more effective administration than traditional institutions had achieved. The conspiracy led by Brutus and Cassius represented the final attempt to restore constitutional government through the elimination of tyrannical power, though their success in removing Caesar only precipitated the final civil wars that would destroy republicanism forever. The Second Triumvirate, formed by Octavian, Mark Antony, and Lepidus in 43 BCE, represented a more ruthless approach to managing the crisis of republican government than the informal arrangements that had characterized the First Alliance. The proscription list that eliminated their political enemies, including the great orator Cicero, demonstrated that the new triumvirs would employ any methods necessary to secure their power and eliminate potential opposition. The Battle of Philippi in 42 BCE, which destroyed the last armies loyal to republican government, marked the definitive end of constitutional rule and the beginning of the imperial system that would govern the Roman world for centuries to come. The defeat and suicide of Brutus and Cassius eliminated the final defenders of traditional institutions, while the division of the empire between the surviving triumvirs created the framework for the final struggle that would determine Rome's ultimate form of government. The growing tensions between Octavian and Mark Antony reflected both personal ambitions and fundamental differences about how Roman power should be exercised in the Eastern Mediterranean. Antony's relationship with Cleopatra and his adoption of Hellenistic royal customs alienated Roman opinion, while providing Octavian with propaganda opportunities that portrayed his rival as a traitor to Roman traditions and values. The final civil war that culminated at Actium in 31 BCE would determine not only which individual would rule the Roman world, but what form that rule would take, and how it would relate to the republican traditions that had created the empire in the first place. The outcome of this naval battle would establish the framework for Roman government that would endure for centuries, while transforming the Mediterranean world in ways that would influence human civilization long after the last Roman legion had marched for the final time. The young man who would emerge victorious from this final conflict possessed both the political acumen to preserve republican forms while exercising monarchical power, and the institutional wisdom to create governmental structures that could manage an empire spanning 3 continents. His transformation from Gaius Octavius into Augustus Caesar would mark not merely a change in leadership, but the birth of a new form of government that would define the relationship between ruler and subjects throughout the Western world for over a millennium to come. The autumn winds of 31 BCE carried more than the salt spray of the Ionian Sea across the waters off Actium. They bore the weight of destiny itself, as 2 fleets maneuvered in formations that would determine whether the Roman world would fragment into competing kingdoms or unite under a single ruler whose vision could encompass the entire Mediterranean basin. The stakes of this naval engagement transcended personal rivalry between Octavian and Mark Antony, representing instead the final resolution of constitutional questions that had tormented the Republic for over a century. Marcus Antonius commanded forces that reflected the cosmopolitan character of the Eastern Mediterranean, with Egyptian gold funding ships crewed by experienced sailors from Alexandria, Rhodes, and the Phoenician coast. His alliance with Cleopatra provided access to resources that exceeded anything available in the Western provinces, while his adoption of Hellenistic royal imagery appealed to populations accustomed to divine kingship rather than republican magistrates. Yet these apparent advantages concealed fundamental weaknesses that Octavian's propaganda had skillfully exploited throughout the months preceding the decisive battle. Roman public opinion, carefully cultivated through senatorial declarations and popular assemblies, viewed Antony's Eastern entanglements as betrayals of ancestral traditions that reduced a Roman imperator to the status of a foreign queen's consort. Octavian's fleet, commanded by the brilliant Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, employed tactical innovations that capitalized on Roman engineering expertise, while exploiting the mobility advantages that lighter vessels provided in confined waters. The Corvus boarding bridges that had proven decisive in earlier naval conflicts had evolved into more sophisticated ramming techniques that could disable enemy ships without the close-quarters combat that Antony's more numerous crews might have dominated. The battle itself unfolded with the methodical precision that characterized Agrippa's military planning, as coordinated attacks isolated individual enemy squadrons, while preventing effective concentration of superior numbers. When Cleopatra's Egyptian contingent withdrew from the engagement, either through cowardice or calculated preservation of resources for future conflicts, the psychological impact proved more devastating than the tactical disadvantage their departure created. Antony's decision to follow his royal ally rather than continue fighting alongside his remaining forces sealed the fate of Republican government's final defenders. His flight from Actium abandoned loyal soldiers and sailors whose dedication to his cause deserved better leadership, while simultaneously confirming Octavian's propaganda portrayal of him as a man whose foreign corruptions had overwhelmed his Roman virtues. The suicides of Antony and Cleopatra in Alexandria the following year eliminated the last credible challenges to Octavian's supremacy, while providing dramatic closure to the Hellenistic era that had dominated Eastern Mediterranean politics since Alexander's death. Their deaths marked not merely personal tragedies, but the end of an entire political system based on competing monarchies whose rivalry had shaped Greek culture for 3 centuries. Octavian's return to Rome in triumph brought with it the enormous challenge of creating governmental structures capable of managing an empire that stretched from Britain to Egypt, while preserving enough republican tradition to maintain legitimacy among citizens who still revered the memory of constitutional government. His genius lay in recognizing that successful imperial administration required both the efficiency of monarchical authority and the participation of traditional elites whose cooperation remained essential for long-term stability. The settlement that emerged from Octavian's careful negotiations with the Senate in 27 BCE created the constitutional framework known as the Principate, a system that concentrated real power in the hands of a single individual while maintaining the appearance of restored republican government. His acceptance of the title Augustus marked the transformation from revolutionary leader to legitimate ruler, while his retention of key republican offices provided continuity with ancestral institutions. The genius of the Augustan settlement lay in its recognition that effective imperial government required both centralized decision-making capabilities and decentralized administrative structures that could accommodate the diverse needs of Mediterranean peoples. Provincial governors retained significant autonomy within their assigned territories, while the emperor's ultimate authority ensured coordination of policies that affected multiple regions. Augustus's military reforms addressed the fundamental problems that had destroyed republican government by creating professional armies whose loyalty belonged to the state rather than individual commanders. The establishment of fixed terms of service, standardized pay scales, and guaranteed retirement benefits eliminated the economic dependencies that ambitious generals had previously exploited for political purposes. The Praetorian Guard that Augustus created represented both a solution to immediate security needs and a potential threat to future imperial stability. These elite soldiers, stationed in Rome itself, provided protection against assassination attempts while serving as visible symbols of imperial power. Yet their proximity to political decision-making and their role in succession disputes would eventually make them kingmakers whose support became essential for imperial legitimacy. The cultural policies that Augustus implemented sought to restore traditional Roman values while accommodating the sophisticated tastes that conquest had introduced among the upper classes. His patronage of poets like Virgil and Ovid created literary works that celebrated both Roman achievement and universal human themes, while his building projects transformed Rome into a city worthy of its status as capital of the world. The Ara Pacis that Augustus commissioned to commemorate his diplomatic successes symbolized the transformation from a republic built on military conquest to an empire sustained by peaceful administration. The altar's sculptural program depicted both traditional Roman religious ceremonies and contemporary imperial family members, creating visual narratives that connected present achievements to ancestral traditions. Augustus's marriage and succession policies revealed his understanding that imperial government required dynastic continuity while avoiding the arbitrary hereditary principles that had characterized Hellenistic kingdoms. His adoption of Tiberius as heir created legal precedents for succession that balanced family connections with demonstrated competence, while his marriage legislation encouraged elite families to produce the children necessary for governmental continuity. The census that Augustus conducted throughout his reign documented the remarkable population recovery that peace and prosperity had enabled after decades of civil warfare. The empire's inhabitants numbered over 50 million people, speaking dozens of languages, while participating in economic networks that connected Britain to India through Mediterranean trading centers. Roman engineering achievements during the early empire created infrastructure that supported this vast population, while demonstrating the practical benefits that imperial government provided to ordinary citizens. Aqueducts supplied fresh water to cities throughout the provinces, while roads connected distant territories to central markets and administrative centers with unprecedented efficiency. The legal developments that occurred under Augustus established principles of jurisprudence that would influence Western legal systems for millennia to come. Roman law evolved from the pragmatic solutions developed for governing Italian communities into comprehensive frameworks for regulating relationships between peoples with different cultural traditions and legal customs. From the legendary she-wolf nursing 2 abandoned infants to the final transformation of republic into empire. We have witnessed humanity's most extraordinary political evolution unfold across more than a millennium of ambition, sacrifice, and relentless expansion. The Romans, who began as muddy hilltop villagers, became the architects of civilization itself, creating governmental institutions, legal frameworks, and cultural achievements that echo through our modern world with undiminished power. As you drift deeper into peaceful slumber, let these ancient voices remind you that greatness emerges not from single moments of glory, but from the patient accumulation of wisdom, courage, and determination across countless generations who dared to dream beyond the horizons of their time.